High above the floor of Winchester Cathedral stand painted mortuary chests associated with some of England's most important medieval rulers and church leaders. One of the names written on them is Cnut. Centuries of rebuilding, political upheaval, and disturbance caused the human remains associated with these medieval figures to become mixed. Modern researchers have therefore turned to archaeology, radiocarbon dating, biological anthropology, historical records, and genetic analysis to understand who may be represented. Among those remains may be Cnut himself. Almost 1,000 years ago, Cnut arrived in England as a Scandinavian challenger to the throne. He endured one of the hardest campaigns of the Viking Age, overcame an English rival, secured the crown, and eventually ruled a political realm reaching across the North Sea. But Winchester holds another mystery. Yet identifying the king is only one mystery. Scandinavian armies had reached England many times before him. Some occupied territory. Others extracted extraordinary payments of silver. Several came remarkably close to transforming England permanently. But Cnut accomplished something more difficult. He did not simply win a kingdom. He learned how to govern it. How did a Scandinavian prince who had once been forced to leave England return and become its accepted king? And how did an unsuccessful first attempt lead to one of the greatest political achievements of the Viking Age? For many people, Cnut the Great is remembered because of a peculiar story involving the sea. A king sits beside the shore and orders the rising tide to stop. The water continues forward, reaches him, and apparently proves the foolishness of a ruler who believed nature itself would obey. But that is not what the medieval story originally meant. The account appears more than a century after Cnut's lifetime. In it, the king deliberately challenges the sea to demonstrate that even the greatest earthly ruler remains powerless before God. There is no contemporary evidence showing that the episode actually happened. And the historical Cnut is considerably more interesting than the legend. He was the son of the Danish ruler Swain Forkbeard. He first attempted to maintain his father's hold over England, lost that position, returned with a new coalition, and fought a prolonged campaign against Edmund Ironside before becoming king in 1016. Cnut later inherited Denmark, established control over Norway, developed alliances across Europe, strengthened royal ties with the church, preserved much of England's legal and administrative machinery, and created a remarkable political network connecting England and Scandinavia. That network did not remain united for long after his lifetime. But Cnut's reign changed 11th century England. To understand how, we must begin before he wore an English crown, when England was among the richest and best organized kingdoms in Northern Europe. If you enjoy evidence-based history, subscribe, like, share, and tell us in the comments which early medieval ruler we should investigate next. At the beginning of the 11th century, England was far more than a distant island vulnerable to ships arriving from Scandinavia. It was one of Northern Europe's richest and most sophisticated kingdoms. Generations of West Saxon rulers had built a political system capable of collecting taxation, enforcing royal law, organizing military obligations, maintaining fortified settlements, and issuing a remarkably controlled silver currency. For Scandinavian leaders, that made England far more valuable than any isolated treasure hoard. A raiding force could take wealth once. A ruler who controlled England could gain access to institutions capable of producing revenue repeatedly. That distinction helps explain why Scandinavian activity in England changed over the centuries. Early expeditions frequently concentrated on exposed monasteries, settlements, and trading centers. Later forces stayed longer, demanded payments, occupied territory, and increasingly participated in English politics. Eventually, the ambition changed from extracting England's wealth to controlling England itself. Cnut was born into a dynasty already central to this transformation. His father was Swain Forkbeard, king of Denmark. His grandfather was Harald Bluetooth, remembered through the Jelling monuments and closely associated with the developing Christian monarchy of Denmark. Cnut therefore belonged to a royal family positioned between overlapping political traditions. One came from the Scandinavian world of ships, warrior retinues, regional alliances, competition between ruling houses, and personal loyalty. The other belonged to the wider Christian monarchies of Europe. Bishops, written legislation, royal ceremony, diplomatic marriage, international legitimacy, and increasingly structured institutions. Cnut's birth date remains uncertain, though he was probably born during the later 10th century. By his youth, England and Scandinavia had already been connected for decades through commerce, migration, tribute, warfare, diplomacy, settlement, and dynastic rivalry. During the reign of Athelred II, better known by the later nickname Athelred the Unready, Scandinavian pressure intensified. English governments repeatedly gathered extraordinary quantities of silver to satisfy attacking forces. These payments are frequently grouped under the familiar term Danegeld, although the underlying systems of tribute and taxation were more complicated than that label suggests. What mattered politically was what the payments demonstrated. England could raise enormous resources. A commander who entered an English settlement could acquire wealth once. A ruler who commanded the English fiscal system could access that wealth again and again. Swain Forkbeard recognized the opportunity. In 1013, after years of campaigning, Swain mounted an exceptionally successful challenge to Ethelred's authority. Major regions accepted him. Resistance weakened. Eventually, Athelred crossed the Channel to Normandy, where his wife Emma possessed powerful family connections. Swain had become King of England. His achievement, however, lasted only a matter of weeks. On February 3, 1014, Swain died. His sudden absence reopened almost every political question the conquest had appeared to settle. The Danish fleet supported Cnut, but influential English nobles invited Athelred to return. The old king came back. Cnut now possessed ships, experienced followers, and a dynastic claim through his father, but not the broad support required to govern England securely. His position collapsed, and he withdrew. At that moment, Cnut could easily have vanished from English political history. His father was gone. Athelred was restored. His elder brother Harold occupied the stronger position in Denmark, leaving Cnut without an obvious crown there either. England now became more than unfinished family business. It may have represented Cnut's best opportunity to secure a kingdom of his own. That helps explain why his return should not be reduced to a stereotype about Scandinavian warriors seeking another campaign. Dynastic politics mattered. Royal legitimacy mattered. English wealth mattered. Personal ambition mattered. And Cnut had witnessed something extremely important. He had seen his father conquer England. He had also watched that achievement unravel almost immediately. The lesson was clear. Military success by itself could not create durable kingship. A king needed recognition. He needed money. He needed regional alliances. He needed administrators. He needed the cooperation, or at least acceptance, of the powerful people who actually made government function. In 1014, Cnut did not yet possess enough of those things. So he left, but he did not abandon his claim. Over the following months, he rebuilt his position and assembled support. When his fleet returned in 1015, he was no longer merely Swain Forkbeard's son attempting to rescue his father's brief achievement. Cnut was now pursuing the English throne for himself. And he arrived at precisely the moment England's own political leadership was beginning to fracture. When Cnut returned in 1015, he did not encounter a kingdom united behind a single political purpose. England remained wealthy, administratively capable, and able to mobilize substantial forces. Its leadership, however, was deeply divided. King Athelred was aging and increasingly unable to dominate political events as he once had. His son Edmund was emerging as an independent power. Major aristocrats pursued competing regional and family interests, and some were prepared to change allegiance if circumstances demanded it. Few figures illustrate the instability better than Edric Striona. Edric was one of the most influential English nobles of the period, and surviving medieval accounts portray him extraordinarily negatively. Chroniclers associate him with betrayal, political violence, and repeated changes of loyalty. Modern historians must be cautious. Medieval writers often transformed complex political crises into morality tales centered on convenient villains. Nevertheless, the wider instability surrounding Edric is impossible to ignore. In 1015, two major northern nobles, Sigefyrth and Morcar, lost their lives during the struggle for power. Edmund subsequently took control of their estates and married Sigefyrth's widow against Ethelred's wishes. The royal household itself was becoming divided. At almost exactly that moment, Cnut arrived. He landed in southern England and began establishing control through Wessex. This was not a quick maritime expedition designed simply to collect valuables and leave. Cnut needed territory. He needed provisions. He needed horses. He needed hostages and guarantees. Most importantly, he needed communities to recognize his authority. Areas of Wessex gradually submitted and provided the logistical support necessary for his army. That transformation was essential. A force arriving by ship could now operate effectively inland. Then Cnut gained an even more valuable advantage. Edric Striona changed allegiance and joined him with ships and followers. Cnut's coalition was no longer simply Scandinavian. English political elites were becoming participants in his attempt to win England. That fact destroys one of the easiest myths surrounding the campaign. This was not a straightforward contest between Vikings on one side and a united Anglo-Saxon England on the other. Englishmen supported Cnut. Scandinavians could support competing leaders. Family interest, local rivalry, personal loyalty, political survival, opportunity, and dynastic calculation frequently mattered more than modern assumptions about ethnicity. Then the situation changed again. In April 1016, Ethelred died. Instead of resolving the succession, his passing created two competing kings. London and important English supporters recognized Edmund, later remembered as Edmund Ironside. Cnut claimed the crown as well. England now faced a direct contest between two rulers, each determined to control the kingdom. The following months became one of the most demanding campaigns recorded in late Anglo-Saxon history. Cnut pressed London. The city resisted. Edmund moved through Wessex gathering supporters. The rivals met repeatedly across southern England. Shurston, Brentford, the Thames crossings, Kent, Mercia, Wessex, Essex. Roads, rivers, fortified towns, supply networks, and local alliances became just as important as battlefield courage. Edmund proved remarkably resilient. Even after setbacks, he rebuilt his following and returned. That persistence helps explain his later reputation as Ironside, whether or not every story attached to the nickname can be trusted. Cnut could gain territory and discover only weeks later that Edmund had assembled another force. At several moments, the outcome remained uncertain. London continued to present a serious obstacle. Edmund possessed substantial support. Cnut depended on allies whose commitment could never be assumed permanently. Nor did either side possess some revolutionary weapon that predetermined the result. Both armies operated within the same broad military culture of Northern Europe. Shields, spears, swords, mobile forces, ships for transport, horses for movement, and infantry formations designed to remain cohesive under pressure. What mattered was endurance, logistics, leadership, political support, and the ability to replace losses and keep mobilizing men. Cnut's advantage gradually increased because he was learning how to combine Scandinavian military resources with English political alliances. Edmund's advantage was legitimacy among English supporters who continued to regard him as their rightful leader. By autumn, they had been contesting the kingdom for months. Then, on October 18, 1016, their forces met at a place called Assandun. Its exact location remains debated, although Ashington in Essex has long been associated with the battle. Here the military struggle and England's internal political divisions finally converged. Assandun would not instantly make Cnut the uncontested king, but it would alter the balance decisively. For the first time since returning to England, Cnut was within reach of the prize that had slipped from his family in 1014.
The Battle of Assandun on October 18, 1016 became a turning point in Cnut's career. The surviving English chronicle describes Edmund gathering his supporters once more and pursuing Cnut into Essex. There the two forces met. Modern audiences often want medieval battle accounts to tell us exactly how many soldiers stood on each side, where each formation moved, and precisely why one force prevailed. The evidence rarely allows that certainty. Instead, surviving accounts focus heavily on loyalty. According to the English chronicler, Edric Striona and his followers withdrew during the battle. The writer presents this as betrayal and connects it directly to Edmund's defeat. Whether Edric's actions occurred exactly as hostile later narratives claimed cannot be established with complete confidence. But Edmund did lose at Assandun, and several prominent members of the English political and ecclesiastical elite did not survive the fighting. Even then, Cnut did not automatically become ruler of all England. That detail is essential. Medieval kingship was not transferred merely because one army won on one field. Authority depended upon recognition, oaths, regional support, negotiation, aristocratic cooperation, and the willingness of political communities to accept a settlement. Edmund survived Assandun. He still had followers. Cnut therefore faced a choice. He could continue a campaign that was consuming the resources of both sides, or he could negotiate. The rivals reached an extraordinary agreement. England would be divided. According to the chronicle tradition, Edmund retained Wessex while Cnut controlled territories farther north. A kingdom that earlier West Saxon rulers had spent generations assembling was temporarily partitioned between an English king and a Scandinavian challenger. Whether either ruler expected that settlement to endure is impossible to know. It never had the opportunity. On November 30, 1016, only weeks after Assandun, Edmund died. Later writers produced dramatic allegations of foul play, but dependable contemporary evidence does not establish such a story. His death removed Cnut's principal rival. By 1017, Cnut was recognized as king throughout England. The conquest had succeeded. Yet acquiring the crown may have been easier than keeping it. Cnut had entered England backed by foreign troops and English defectors. Now he had to rule a population that had endured decades of Scandinavian pressure, major taxation, political instability, and repeated campaigns. The warriors who supported him expected rewards. English nobles might remain suspicious. Members of the former royal dynasty were still alive. The church possessed enormous institutional authority, and local government depended upon men who understood England's administrative structure far better than most of Cnut's Scandinavian followers did. Attempting to govern England indefinitely as occupied territory would have required a huge military presence. Maintaining such a force would have required equally huge revenue. Cnut chose a different approach. The earliest stage of his reign was undeniably severe. Opponents were removed from positions of influence. Property changed hands. Some members of the political elite faced the harshest penalties available to a medieval ruler. Even Edric Striona, who had helped Cnut during the struggle, did not survive the political settlement of 1017. From Cnut's perspective, an aristocrat famous for changing allegiance was also an aristocrat who might change allegiance again. The new king reorganized high government around major earldoms. Powerful regional figures could mobilize military support, enforce royal authority, and administer territories while the king operated elsewhere. The arrangement was practical. It was also dangerous. Any earl who became indispensable to royal government could become extraordinarily powerful in his own right. Still, Cnut quickly demonstrated that coercion could not provide the sole foundation of his monarchy. Once the immediate succession crisis had passed, continuity became increasingly important. The English minting system continued. Local government continued. Shires and assemblies continued. Church leaders continued to advise the crown. Existing legal traditions remained central. Cnut increasingly presented himself not as the commander of a Scandinavian occupation force, but as a legitimate Christian king of the English. Nothing demonstrates that transformation more clearly than his marriage. In 1017, Cnut married Emma of Normandy. Emma was the widow of Athelred. She was also the mother of surviving members of the dynasty Cnut had replaced. The marriage was both ingenious and complicated. It tied Cnut directly to England's former royal household. It connected him with Normandy. And any children produced by the marriage could claim legitimacy from both Cnut's victorious dynasty and Emma's established royal position. The campaign of 1015 to 1016 had allowed Cnut to take the crown. Edmund's death had removed his strongest rival. Neither event guaranteed stable government. Cnut's greater achievement would be persuading enough nobles, bishops, administrators, landowners, towns, and military leaders that cooperation with the new monarchy offered greater security than resistance. He had arrived as a Scandinavian prince seeking England. Now he had to become England's king.
Cnut's marriage to Emma in 1017 was among the most consequential political decisions of his reign. Emma was much more than Ethelred's widow. She had already spent years operating inside English royal politics. She came from Normandy's ruling family, and her sons from her first marriage represented the surviving West Saxon dynasty. Among them were Edward, the future Edward the Confessor, and Alfred. After Cnut's conquest, they remained outside England and could potentially become alternative focuses for political opposition. Marriage to Emma altered the equation. Cnut connected his new monarchy directly to the household he had displaced. At the same time, he strengthened relations with Normandy and increased the international respectability of his government. For medieval kings, marriage functioned as political architecture. It created alliances, claims, expectations, obligations, and possible lines of succession. Emma brought all of these. But Cnut's family situation was already complicated. Before marrying Emma, he had a long-standing relationship with Elfgefu of Northampton, an Englishwoman connected with powerful families in the Midlands. Their sons included Swain and Harold. Cnut and Emma later had Harthacnut and a daughter, Gunhilda. The king therefore presided over two family branches, each capable of attracting political supporters and succession claims. Cnut managed that tension while he lived. Afterward, it would become one of the central weaknesses of his dynasty. Emma also became crucial to the public image of Cnut's kingship. One of the most remarkable surviving representations from the period appears in the New Minster Liber Vitae, now British Library Stowe MS 944. It shows Cnut and Emma presenting a cross at the New Minster in Winchester, beneath a distinctly Christian vision of sacred monarchy. The British Library catalogue identifies the image directly as Cnut and Emma presenting the cross. The significance is difficult to overstate. Cnut had entered England as a foreign challenger. Within years, an English religious manuscript presented him crowned, alongside an established queen, participating in the sacred visual language of Christian kingship. This was more than decoration. Medieval monarchy operated through religion as well as military and political authority. Bishops participated in royal government. Churches preserved royal memory. Monastic communities prayed for rulers. Ceremony placed political power inside a wider Christian understanding of order. Cnut embraced these traditions. He gave gifts to religious institutions. He supported churches and monasteries. He honored saints. He participated in major ceremonies. And he increasingly presented royal authority as a responsibility connected with justice and Christian rule. One important moment came in 1023. Archbishop Elfhe of Canterbury had been seized by a Scandinavian force in 1011 and died while held by them the following year after refusing to permit the payment of a ransom for his release. Cnut had not been King of England at the time, and there is no basis for treating him as personally responsible. But the political memory of Elfhe mattered. In 1023, Cnut participated in the formal transfer of the archbishop's remains from London to Canterbury. Emma and Harthacnut were associated with the ceremony. The symbolism was remarkable. A Scandinavian monarch was publicly honoring a churchman whose fate had become associated with an earlier Scandinavian campaign. Rather than attempting to erase that uncomfortable memory, Cnut incorporated it into his Christian kingship. Something similar happened with Assandun. Cnut supported a church associated with the location of his decisive victory. A place remembered for political conflict became part of a Christian landscape of commemoration. It would be too simple to dismiss every religious act as propaganda. Medieval rulers could act strategically and sincerely at the same time. For Cnut, religion and politics were probably inseparable. Christian kingship gave him a language through which conquest could become legitimate government. Emma supplied another bridge. She connected his monarchy to what had existed before it. She also became one of the most significant political figures of the 11th century. Her children belonged to two royal dynasties. Her Norman family links remained important. Her son Edward eventually became king. Edward's later lack of a direct heir would contribute to the succession crisis of 1066. Cnut's marriage therefore affected far more than the immediate problem of stabilizing England after 1016. It shaped political relationships for decades, and it revealed one of the most important qualities of Cnut's rule. He did not attempt to erase everything he had conquered. He married into the old dynasty. He worked with the English church. He relied increasingly on English elites. He preserved institutions that already functioned. Conquest had opened the road to kingship. Adaptation would make that kingship durable. A silver penny may tell us more about Cnut's success than a Viking sword ever could. On English coins from his reign, Cnut appears as a recognizable Christian monarch, crowned or helmeted, surrounded by his royal title. The image is far removed from the familiar popular picture of a Scandinavian raider aboard a longship. That difference is important. Coinage was administration. Producing standardized silver pennies across a kingdom required mints, moneyers, officials, regulated weights, recognized authority, and a political system capable of sustaining confidence in the currency. Cnut did not invent that machinery. He inherited it from the English rulers he defeated, and he was wise enough to preserve it. The same principle shaped much of his government. England was valuable precisely because it possessed effective institutions. Destroying those institutions would have damaged the prize. Shires remained. Assemblies remained. Royal officials remained important. Coin production continued. Written law remained fundamental. In 1018, Cnut's government participated in a settlement at Oxford in which English and Danish elites affirmed an agreed political order grounded heavily in established English law. The surviving Oxford Code states that peace and friendship were confirmed between Danes and English, and refers explicitly to following Edgar's laws. Cnut later issued the substantial Winchester Code of 1020 to 1021, associated with Archbishop Wulfstan, and built extensively on earlier English legal traditions. Early English laws describes it as the fullest single surviving record of Anglo-Saxon law, and notes how heavily it drew on previous legislation. That tells us something fundamental about Cnut's political strategy. He did not present himself as a foreign ruler abolishing everything that came before him. He presented himself as a protector of lawful order. For a kingdom exhausted by years of campaigning, tribute, dynastic rivalry, and political uncertainty, order itself could become a source of legitimacy. People might accept a conqueror more readily if that conqueror provided predictable law, protected property, maintained roads and commerce, restrained disorder, and prevented another large army from arriving. Cnut also had to address the expectations of the Scandinavian force that had helped him win. In 1018, a vast payment of silver was raised to discharge much of that army. London carried a particularly large share of the burden. Once most of those troops had departed, Cnut no longer needed to govern through permanent large-scale occupation. A smaller military household remained, but England increasingly functioned through England's own government. That may have been the most important transition of the entire reign. A huge foreign force would have been expensive. It would have been politically destabilizing, and it would have consumed the revenue that made England attractive in the first place. Instead, English taxation supported the monarchy. English nobles administered regions. English bishops reinforced royal authority. English courts applied the law. English mints placed Cnut's name and image into everyday economic life. The conquered kingdom became the machinery supporting its conqueror. This does not mean the reign was universally gentle or prosperous. The early settlement involved severe political measures. Property was redistributed. Heavy fiscal demands could burden communities. Powerful regional officials could misuse their position. And the campaigns preceding Cnut's rule had disrupted large areas. But the institutions survived. Because they survived, Cnut could eventually spend considerable periods outside England without the kingdom simply falling apart. That became increasingly important. Across the North Sea, another crown was about to become available. Cnut had also learned to present himself differently in different political settings without abandoning the core of his authority. In England, he was king of the English. In Denmark, he would rule through Danish traditions. Before military followers, he remained a successful commander. Before bishops, he could appear as a Christian ruler charged with maintaining justice. Before European courts, he operated through dynastic diplomacy. This flexibility was not necessarily deception. Medieval monarchy depended upon different relationships with different communities. A ruler who demanded that every region adopt a single political model would invite unnecessary resistance. Cnut's achievement was recognizing that England did not need to become Denmark. Nor did Denmark need to become England. He could rule both while leaving much of their internal political identity intact. That is also why historians use the phrase North Sea Empire cautiously. It is convenient, but Cnut did not construct a centralized modern state with one bureaucracy governing every territory. His power rested on several distinct kingdoms connected through the person of the king, his household, his reputation, his financial resources, dynastic claims, military strength, and political alliances. England became the strongest financial base in that system because its institutions could raise extraordinary resources. The young Scandinavian prince who once crossed the sea in pursuit of English silver had discovered something more powerful than taking money from the kingdom. Control the mint. Control the taxation system. Control the courts. Work with the bishops. Work with the earls. Preserve the institutions. The army had helped Cnut win England. Government allowed him to keep it.
In 1018, Cnut's elder brother Harald died. Cnut became king of Denmark. His political position changed immediately. England was no longer an isolated possession held by a successful Scandinavian conqueror. It now formed part of a wider monarchy connecting England and Denmark. Modern maps encourage us to see the North Sea as a barrier dividing Britain from Scandinavia. For Cnut, it was also a highway. Ships could carry people, messages, silver, officials, merchants, churchmen, and military forces more efficiently than many overland routes. The sea connected his kingdoms. England strengthened Cnut's authority in Denmark because English revenue gave him extraordinary resources. Denmark strengthened his authority in England because control of the Danish monarchy reduced the danger that another powerful ruler might use Denmark as the base for a new challenge. The two kingdoms supported each other, but they did not merge. England retained English law, English coinage, English bishops, and English structures of local administration. Denmark retained its own aristocracy and political traditions. Cnut stood between them as the personal link. During the 1020s, his ambitions expanded. Scandinavian politics remained intensely competitive. Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish dynasties formed and abandoned alliances according to circumstance. In Norway, King Olaf Haraldsson had established his own authority but faced significant opposition among local elites. Cnut learned to exploit those divisions. The precise reconstruction of Scandinavian events can be difficult. Some of the richest narrative accounts were written well after Cnut's lifetime. Skaldic poetry preserves valuable evidence but can be challenging to interpret. Even so, the broad result is clear. By 1028, Cnut had successfully established control over Norway. Olaf was forced out. Cnut attempted to govern through trusted supporters and members of his family. For a brief period, his political reach extended across England, Denmark, Norway, and areas entangled in Swedish politics. This was the height of his career. The prince who had fled England in 1014 now ruled a northern European political network greater than anything his father had securely maintained. But Norway also exposed the limitations of Cnut's system. Control depended upon local alliances. Norwegian elites had interests of their own. Support for Cnut did not mean permanent loyalty to a distant English-Danish monarchy. When political interests changed, his authority there weakened. The pattern appears repeatedly across his reign. Cnut was powerful because he was exceptionally effective at constructing coalitions. But a coalition is not the same thing as absolute rule. His growing international status also became visible beyond Scandinavia. Cnut cultivated relationships with rulers on the continent. His daughter Gunhilda later married into the imperial dynasty. And in 1027, Cnut traveled to Rome around the time of Emperor Conrad II's coronation. The journey was simultaneously religious and diplomatic. Cnut presented himself as a Christian pilgrim. But he also moved within the company of popes, emperors, and other major rulers. Afterward, a royal letter circulated among his English subjects. Although its transmission survives through later manuscript copies and must therefore be interpreted carefully, it provides one of the clearest windows into the identity Cnut wished to project. He described his authority across England, Denmark, Norway, and part of Sweden. He explained the Rome journey in religious language. But he also presented practical political achievements. He claimed to have negotiated over conditions affecting travelers and merchants. He raised concerns about charges affecting English churchmen traveling to Rome. He promised justice. He condemned improper exactions. And he portrayed himself as a ruler actively defending the interests of his subjects. A royal letter is not an objective report. It is political communication. But that is precisely why it matters. Cnut wanted his subjects to imagine him as something far greater than a victorious military commander. He was presenting himself as an international Christian monarch able to negotiate at the highest level of European politics. His power now rested on multiple identities: Scandinavian dynast, English king, successful commander, Christian patron, lawgiver, diplomatic monarch. The scale of the achievement was extraordinary, but its weakness was equally obvious. England was England. Denmark was Denmark. Norway remained Norway. They were not integrated provinces of a single permanent state. Their unity depended overwhelmingly on one king. As long as Cnut could travel, negotiate, reward supporters, balance elites, and maintain his reputation, the system could function. Whether anyone else could inherit the entire structure was another question.
Popular culture often treats Viking and Christian as opposing identities. Cnut's life demonstrates why that picture is too simple. By the beginning of the 11th century, Scandinavian rulers had already been engaging with Christianity for generations. Cnut's grandfather Harald Bluetooth had famously connected Danish royal identity with Christianity. Cnut therefore did not suddenly abandon an entirely pagan worldview after conquering England. He came from a dynasty already participating in Europe's expanding Christian political culture. What England offered was a particularly mature tradition of Christian monarchy. English rulers had worked closely with bishops and monasteries for centuries. Written law connected royal authority to religious duty. Coronation rites portrayed kings as defenders of the church and guardians of justice. Monastic communities preserved royal memory. Cnut adopted these practices enthusiastically. He gave wealth and property to churches. He supported religious houses. He participated in ceremonies. He issued legislation concerned with Christian observance. The new Minster image of Cnut and Emma presenting a cross captured the transformation visually. The former Scandinavian challenger now appeared as an English Christian monarch beneath a sacred order. His visit to Rome reinforced the same identity. In his later letter, Cnut spoke about repentance, justice, proper government, and responsibility toward his subjects. We cannot know precisely what he believed privately. History allows us to examine actions, surviving statements, institutions, and political behavior. It cannot measure the inner faith of an 11th century king. More importantly, the modern distinction between sincere religion and political strategy may not fit his world. Cnut could genuinely believe that kingship carried Christian responsibilities, while also understanding that cooperation with the church strengthened the monarchy. Religion and politics were intertwined. That brings us to the most famous story associated with his name, the Tide. The account comes from the 12th century historian Henry of Huntingdon. In Henry's version, Cnut's courtiers praise the king's power so extravagantly that he decides to demonstrate its limits. A royal seat is placed by the shore. Cnut commands the incoming water not to advance. The sea continues according to nature. Cnut then uses the failure of his command as a lesson. Earthly kings, however powerful, remain limited before God. Later retellings transformed the episode. Instead of a demonstration of humility, Cnut became a foolish ruler who imagined he could literally command the ocean. That version still appears in political jokes and commentary, but it reverses the message of Henry's story. Henry's Cnut is not being exposed as arrogant. He is exposing the absurdity of unlimited royal pride. There is no account from Cnut's lifetime confirming that the event occurred. It first appears more than a century later. It therefore cannot be treated as eyewitness history. Yet the story remains historically valuable. Legends tell us how later generations chose to remember people. Henry's readers encountered a Cnut powerful enough to inspire excessive praise, yet religious enough to reject the idea that royal power had no boundaries. Curiously, that message resembles something genuine about Cnut's political success. He understood limits. He could not govern England without people who knew English government. He could not ignore the great earls. He could not dismiss bishops. He could not treat local law as irrelevant. He could not govern Denmark exactly as he governed England. He could not assume Norway would remain obedient simply because he claimed its crown. Instead of pretending those constraints did not exist, Cnut worked through them. That may have been one of his greatest political strengths. Among the important figures who rose during his reign was Earl Godwine. Godwine became a dominant figure in English politics and remained powerful after Cnut. His family eventually stood at the center of Edward the Confessor's court. His son Harold Godwinson became king in 1066. That is another indication of how Cnut's legacy survived without his empire. The networks created during his reign endured. Families rose. Marriages mattered. Political careers continued. Expectations of power shifted. The Tide story is almost certainly legend rather than documented episode, but its central idea remains strangely fitting. Cnut became one of Northern Europe's most powerful rulers. Even he could not command everything. Noble loyalty changed. Kingdoms possessed their own traditions. Dynastic succession produced rivalry. The church held independent influence. Distance constrained royal government. Local elites pursued their own interests. Cnut's achievement did not come from ignoring those realities. It came from understanding them. That understanding helped him reach the height of his power. It could not guarantee what would happen once he was no longer there to hold the system together. By the early 1030s, Cnut occupied a position that would have seemed improbable when he withdrew from England in 1014. He was king of England and Denmark. He had established authority over Norway. His family possessed connections to major European dynasties. English wealth circulated through Scandinavian political networks. Churchmen and royal agents crossed the North Sea. Powerful earls administered territory when the king was absent. For a time, the system worked. But almost every element depended heavily upon Cnut himself. That was the fundamental weakness of his realm. England and Denmark were not administrative districts inside one centralized empire. Norway had not been completely integrated. Each kingdom possessed ambitious elites, regional loyalties, and political traditions of its own. Cnut could balance them because he possessed extraordinary wealth, royal legitimacy, military prestige, decades of experience, and a proven ability to build alliances. His successors would not automatically inherit those qualities. The succession problem was made harder by Cnut's family. His relationship with Ælfgifu of Northampton had produced Swain and Harold. His marriage to Emma had produced Harthacnut. Each son could attract different supporters. Harthacnut enjoyed the prestige associated with Emma and became particularly important in Denmark. Harold developed substantial support in England. Swain became involved in governing Norway alongside Ælfgifu. Norway soon demonstrated how fragile Cnutian authority could be. Local opposition strengthened. The arrangement imposed through Cnut's family did not become permanent. Then, on November 12, 1035, Cnut died. His exact age is uncertain because historians do not know his birth year with confidence, but he was probably still only in his late 30s or early 40s. He was buried at Winchester, one of England's greatest royal and ecclesiastical centers. The burial carried its own symbolism. Cnut had once arrived as an outsider seeking the English crown. He ended his life as a king laid to rest at the heart of English royal tradition. His disappearance immediately revealed how dependent the wider political system had been on him. Harthacnut was occupied in Scandinavia. Harold Harefoot gained increasing authority in England and eventually became king. Emma's political position weakened, and she left the center of English power. After Harold's death in 1040, Harthacnut finally secured England. His reign, however, lasted only around 2 years. He died in 1042. Cnut's direct dynasty no longer controlled the English crown. England then turned to Edward the Confessor, Emma's son by Athelred. The older West Saxon dynasty had returned. From one perspective, Cnut's North Sea project vanished remarkably quickly. He became King of England in 1016. By 1042, his immediate dynasty no longer ruled it. Norway had broken away. The political union across the North Sea had fractured. But political importance cannot be measured only by whether a dynasty survives indefinitely. institutions and relationships can outlive a kingdom. Godwine had become exceptionally powerful under Cnut and remained central under Edward. His children would dominate the next generation. Emma remained a crucial dynastic connection between England, Normandy, and Cnut's family. Scandinavian monarchs continued to view England as part of a wider northern political world. Normandy remained connected to English succession through Emma and Edward. When Edward died without a direct heir in January 1066, those overlapping relationships became explosive. Harold Godwinson took the English crown. Harald Hardrada of Norway advanced a Scandinavian claim. William of Normandy asserted his own right from across the Channel. Cnut did not directly cause the events of 1066. History should not be turned into a simple chain in which every event inevitably produces the next. But the England of 1066 cannot be understood completely without the political world that Cnut helped shape. His reign proved that an outside dynasty could take England and then govern effectively through English institutions. It connected English and Scandinavian aristocracies more closely. It contributed to the extraordinary rise of Godwine's family. It strengthened Emma's importance and therefore reinforced connections with Normandy. It positioned England inside a North Sea and Channel world of overlapping dynastic claims. Cnut's empire disappeared. The political relationships surrounding it did not.
Cnut's story returns to Winchester Cathedral. He was buried at Winchester in 1035, but the cathedral visible today is not the same structure in which his burial originally took place. The Anglo-Saxon Old Minster was eventually replaced following the Norman conquest. Royal and ecclesiastical burials were relocated. Tombs were reorganized. Generations passed. The remains associated with kings, queens, bishops, and other high-status individuals eventually came to be held in decorated mortuary chests. Then came further disturbance. During the English Civil War, soldiers entered Winchester Cathedral and disrupted the contents of the chests. The remains were later gathered again, but their original individual associations had been lost. That created an extraordinary historical puzzle. The chests carried famous royal names, including Cnut and Queen Emma. But a name painted on a chest could no longer be treated as a reliable identification of the individuals inside it. Modern researchers therefore began a major interdisciplinary investigation. Archaeologists, osteologists, historians, conservators, radiocarbon specialists, genetic researchers. More than 1,000 individual pieces of human remains were examined and reorganized. The objective was not simply to determine their approximate age. Researchers attempted to understand which remains might belong together, estimate age and biological sex, examine physical relationships, and reconstruct partial individuals from material disturbed repeatedly across centuries. Radiocarbon analysis helped establish chronological ranges. But even that evidence required care. Diet can influence radiocarbon measurements. High-status medieval individuals may have consumed substantial amounts of fish and other marine resources, producing what researchers call a marine reservoir effect that can make radiocarbon dates appear older than the individual's true calendar age. The University of Bristol's earlier project report described the examination of more than 1,300 bones and the reconstruction of at least 23 partial individuals, far more than had once been assumed. Researchers also identified a mature female from the appropriate Broad period who became a possible candidate for Emma, while stressing that the attribution was not certain. Genetic analysis offered another path. DNA may help researchers identify biological relationships or separate remains belonging to different people. Ancient DNA, however, presents significant technical difficulties, particularly when material has been repeatedly moved, handled, and regrouped over centuries. And caution remains crucial. A dramatic documentary might be tempted to announce that modern science has finally located Cnut. The publicly available evidence does not justify that conclusion. The latest Winchester Cathedral project material available as of August 2026 says that the remains were being reinterred following more than a decade of analysis. The cathedral also states that confirming individual identities with certainty is extremely difficult and that DNA evidence may improve understanding. Its project page says further work and publication are continuing. So the responsible conclusion remains deliberately cautious. Cnut may be represented among the medieval remains associated with Winchester's mortuary chests. But a definitive public identification of an individual as Cnut has not been established in the official material currently available. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is how careful historical research operates. Good evidence does not always give us perfect answers. Sometimes it gives us probabilities. And in that respect, Winchester is an ideal ending to Cnut's story. Almost everything we know about him comes from fragments that must be interpreted together. Chronicles describe campaigns, but chroniclers possessed political agendas and inherited traditions. The encomium Emmi Regini contains important information, but it was written in support of Emma and her family. Cnut's legislation demonstrates how his government wanted lawful order to function, but laws cannot tell us exactly how every local dispute was resolved. Coins communicate royal identity, not Cnut's precise appearance. Royal letters reveal political ideals, but they are also carefully constructed public statements. The Tide story reveals how a 12th century writer remembered the king, not what can be proved to have occurred on an 11th century shoreline. Winchester's human remains contain biological information, yet centuries of disruption make identification complex. To reconstruct Cnut, historians must combine fragments. And once those fragments are assembled, the familiar picture of a Viking conqueror begins to change. Cnut was a warrior. But warfare alone cannot explain his success. He was a Christian monarch. Religion alone cannot explain him either. He was Scandinavian, yet his strongest kingdom depended upon English institutions. He assembled an extraordinary political realm, but he never created a centralized structure capable of surviving independently of his personal authority. He could be uncompromising while establishing control and remarkably adaptive once that control had been secured. His life belongs to a moment when the Viking Age itself was changing. Mobile war leaders were becoming territorial monarchs. Tribute increasingly interacted with institutional taxation. Royal households operated alongside churches, written law, coinage, administration, and international diplomacy. Cnut stood near the center of that transformation. He came to England determined to acquire a kingdom. England taught him how to govern one.
Cnut the Great is still introduced as the king who supposedly attempted to command the tide. But his actual career needs no such legend. He began as a younger member of a Scandinavian ruling family. His father Swain Forkbeard succeeded in taking England, but died before the new monarchy could become secure. Cnut attempted to maintain his family's position. He failed. He left. And then he returned. He entered an England divided by internal political rivalry. He assembled alliances. He challenged Edmund Ironside through a prolonged and demanding campaign. He prevailed at Assandun. Following Edmund's death, he became king across England. But the remarkable part of Cnut's achievement came after the campaign. He understood that England's institutions were worth more intact than dismantled. He kept the minting system functioning. He worked through English law. He relied on English nobles and bishops. He married Emma of Normandy, connecting his dynasty with the royal household he had displaced. He paid off much of the force that had helped him win and transformed conquest into functioning monarchy. Later, He became king of Denmark. He established authority in Norway. He traveled to Rome. He communicated with some of Europe's most powerful Christian rulers. For a time, he stood at the center of a political world stretching across the North Sea. Yet the scale of his authority concealed a weakness. His kingdoms remained distinct. Their unity depended primarily upon him. When Cnut died in 1035, the structure began to separate. Norway moved beyond his family's control. His sons competed for authority. By 1042, Cnut's direct dynasty no longer occupied the English throne. Still, the consequences of his reign continued. Through Emma, through Edward the Confessor, through Earl Godwine and his family, through Scandinavian claims, through Norman connections, and through the political landscape that eventually produced the succession crisis of 1066. Nearly 1,000 years later, even Cnut's physical identity remains uncertain. His name survives among the inscriptions associated with Winchester's mortuary chests, while researchers continue attempting to understand the people represented there. Perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. Cnut cannot be reduced to one battle, one empire, one legend, or one set of remains. The surviving evidence reveals something much more interesting. He was a conqueror who discovered that winning was not enough. Military strength might open the path to a crown, but institutions, alliances, taxation, law, religion, administration, compromise, and political intelligence were what allowed a king to remain there. Cnut did not simply pull England into a Scandinavian political world. England transformed Cnut as well. The Scandinavian challenger became an English king because he learned to govern through the society he had conquered. He could not command the sea. He could not make his political realm survive forever. And he could not determine how later centuries would remember him. But for almost 2 decades, Cnut held England securely and stood at the center of one of medieval Northern Europe's most remarkable experiments in kingship. That achievement is far more extraordinary than the story of a king sitting beside the waves.